So as I understand it, what we thought we would talk about a little bit is the sort of ZHA and the kind of early dip into the digital. Or this kind of a little bit about this transition. Maybe we'll test out some ideas that we can then retreat from in the main episode if they seem.
Yeah, this is based on the first flush of reading and looking, rather than the final considered opinions. But something is very clear, which is that the early practice of Zaha Hadid, the early studio practice, is one powered by sketches, paintings, and careful perspectival drawings, or careful technical drawings. And then there's a period where there's quite a few models, particularly plexiglass models and paper models, which exist in this sort of little studio, which I imagine being like some little kind of workshop studio, like there's like one room or two rooms, and there's like 8 people or whatever, all beavering away quietly. Zaha Hadid doing a lot of painting. And then there is the later version, which is very powered by computers.
Yeah, the kind of late version ZHA is really a studio more or less at the state of the art of digital design and representation. Going down a particular kind of sort of path is become a little bit passé. It's sort of locked into a particular trajectory there, but definitely breaking new ground.
It was not as passé when we first started studying architecture. It still sort of seemed like, in like 2007 or whenever, it seemed like it was something where people were trying to move things on.
I think it carried on being pretty cool quite a lot after that as well.
But they have a kind of slightly different vibe to them, and the sort of function a bit differently. Like Vitra, the Vitra fire station, I think was done without any computers. And that meant that they did a huge number of perspective drawings of lots of different angles of it.
In order to evaluate whether it was doing what they wanted it to.
Which is a strange way of doing it. I would normally always do a model before having to do 30 perspective drawings. Perspective drawings are slow.
Normally you do perspective drawings for the client.
Even you get someone else to do them. I wish there were better books, or at least I had access to them, of more of these drawings. There's so much kind of beautiful production at this time, and I don't feel like every time I look at a lecture I see a whole load more paintings.
Yeah, the archive must be very full.
Look pretty cool. Not all of them I think are great, but lots of them are pretty striking.
Well, as always happens, you get the kind of canonical image for each project, don't you? Which is the one that goes into the Betsky book, then becomes the Pinterest one, and it's the one that goes into everyone's lecture about it. But yeah, when you look at, there are these lectures of Zaha and also Patrick Schumacher and doing lectures during the 90s, and Zaha doing quite a lot of them quite a lot earlier as well, where you see, the other 20 drawings. Yeah, the other 20 drawings for that project, which are, kind of interesting.
But times were a-changing. Patrick, I think, joins the office in 1988, which is pretty well before anything is built, but quite a long time after the peak.
It's sort of interesting. So he worked there as a kind of junior, did he?
I mean, he was the project architect for Vitra 5 years later, so I just don't think there were very many people there.
That's certainly what it says on Design. I've heard other identities for the project architect of that. I think that there was a bit of a kind of vacuum of buildings expertise, because it wasn't something they did an enormous amount of at that point.
There's a bit that I think is kind of revealing in the chat you had, where he said that on the IBA building, there are all these each piece of glass is very expensive because it's curved and different. But that's completely pointless. They may as well not be. With a slightly different approach, you could have achieved exactly the same effect with really not bothering. Maybe they started with the idea that you do a drawing, and then the people, it's not really your job to figure out how they're going to do that, but they're going to do it exactly like the drawing.
So in the mid-90s, you start getting the kind of computer-rendered projects. But who's doing those? So is it Schumacher doing those, or are other people in the office? The like fly through of the Vienna proposal, for example.
I don't know. The very first projects where they had computers, people outside the office did them. So that would be in the early 80s when they were doing renders of the Hong Kong scheme. You know, they would bring in people to do that specifically. Presumably there was no possibility of having machines to do it on and stuff, you know, at the really basic level. I mean, I don't think he came in to the studio with any particular computer knowledge. So,
because he also went off and did his PhD, didn't he? He was.
I mean, I think we could explain who he is as well. Like, we perhaps haven't done that. It's Patrick Schumacher, who's, for most of the office's history, the kind of right-hand man. He also headed up DRL in the AA school, which is this sort of... It's like a graduate research thing, doing computers. They did loads of parametric modelling. I can remember them as like all these very earnest, like skinny guys in dark clothing.
He's I think possibly the coiner of the term parametricism, and certainly its chief defender and ideologist. He's the CEO of the successor Zaha Hadid Architects, the Zaha-less.
There was certainly a bit of struggling over what would happen with the office. And he's also a sort of provocateur, really.
Yeah, he loves to argue, doesn't he?
He loves to argue, yes. He used to always sit in the lectures and, like, heckle whoever was giving it.
Yeah, well, he gets this rather droll intro, I think, from Mark Cousins for one of his lectures, where he says, "So today Patrick's giving the lecture, which is unfortunately because it will deprive the audience of its chief question asker. Got a commitment to the discourse."
Which actually went on. He's always been very engaged in and always putting out papers and stuff, and occasionally making pretty off-colour political remarks. The key thing for us is that he's this amazingly enthusiastic pusher of and developer of the tech of computer as a design tool beyond just a drawing tool, and what a computer can do.
I think we'll need to get into what all of that is. I think that actually the period that we're talking about, it's clear how limited the computer is. If you look at there's this sort of big American tower, and then there's the unsuccessful competition entry for the Vienna boiler house site. The computer visuals essentially look a little bit like some of the concept art from the Alien film or something, like 15 years earlier. They're very basic sort of mesh polygon models, which really just are usable to kind of broadly show, with the aid of a bit of transparency, the kind of overall disposition of the different volumes in three-dimensional space. And you can do these completely amazingly unsuccessful, I think, sort of Tron-like fly-throughs.
Like, all the drawing programs used to crash all the time until 2004 or something. Like, until sometime in the new millennium, they would just regularly crash. Like, even AutoCAD used to just crash all the time.
AutoCAD on Mac still does that.
Yeah.
Rhinoceros. Quite hard to get Rhinoceros to crash. You can get it to do a task which is so intensive that it will never finish. Yeah, but
it just never finishes it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but then again, actually, like, just Windows would crash until like Windows XP. It would just, if you left Windows 95 lying around for a while, you just left it on, it would crash. All of its own accord.
I mean, this is all total tangent on tangent. I was thinking about they've done like a remake of Final Fantasy VII, which is one of the great 90s computer games. My progress through it was very, very like stunted by the fact that it would just crash all the time. You would go into like a fight animation, the computer would hang. That'd be it. You'd have to go back to the last save. Sometimes it would just crash repeatedly at the same point. Technically, it would have been possible to patch it or something, but like, as a not very computer literate teenager trying to do that sort of thing in DOS or whatever.
Yeah. You had to work back then. Like, the computers did have lovely, like, graphical user interfaces, but you couldn't use the graphical user interface at the same time as another program. So if you actually wanted to run anything, you'd have to go out to DOS, launch it in DOS, and then you're away. Anyways, so in that kind of environment, I was wondering if you thought that they were actually getting computer drawings and then painting over some of them as well.
It's possible. I mean, in those computer projects, it seems almost actually that they kind of reached an impasse. They know they've got to try and bring the computers in to solve some of the problems of the complex buildings. But then the buildings actually seem to have gone backwards quite a long way through having to be realizable in the computer. Like the Vienna scheme looks like a building designed by someone who's having to do it in a computer and is not very good at doing it.
The Vienna one is bad. I'm glad it didn't win the competition. I mean, none of the things that in that competition got built. But this one is a bad one. Like, a lot of the projects have a lot of potential and interest that she's doing at this time. This one is really clunky, kind of unresolved. It's like a pixelated box.
Yeah, it tries to solve it. It tries to solve it all by having like it's trying to have a virtual reality facade, which is a sort of all-purpose get out that was available to people at that point in the dying days of cyberpunk.
Yeah, did that just mean like a projection? Did that just mean you had like a big slide projector in it?
It's a big rip-off of the ZKM or something, I don't know. Or there's that, there's the kind of American project, which is really looks, the big orange skyscraper. What's that one called?
Now, this project actually I think is kind of an interesting project. Let me find it in books. And lots of very different sorts of images come up of it. But it's like drawn in such extraordinarily different ways.
This is something which you would get a third-class degree for if it was your final project. It's one of those ones where it's like, yeah. Things did have to go backwards to go forward a bit in the age of the early computer.
The 42nd Street Hotel, like in the better representations of it, it feels a bit REM. Like, it's this patchwork of all these different cladding styles, like weirdly collaged together. It's got this weird atrium with all these bridges in it. But the computer drawings of it are absolutely ridiculous. They're like, firstly, it's like this weird orange background. Everything is semi-transparent. It's got a fisheye lens effect, so it really looks like Toy Town. I mean, it's massively
It looks like they haven't really been...
Like, it would look a bit crappy in a PlayStation game.
It looks like they haven't really been able to draw the building as designed in the computer model, doesn't it?
No, it looks like they've only been able to use right angles. And then what they've done, which is kind of ironic given the architect we're talking about, and then what they've done, if they put a fisheye lens effect on it to mean that it's, in the renderer, to mean that it's not all just straight. But the building, as proposed, isn't like that at all. It looks like a kind of interesting idea of a tower made of, like, lots of piled up different boxes. Like a sort of Jenga stack of strange, sort of Jenga Tetris, right? With an atrium that goes all the way down, which is kind of an idea that kept coming up in their projects, actually. They've actually done one now, I think.
Yeah, it looks unbelievable, the one that they've done. That's a very recent project. It looks like a real bit of like map painting from a minor Star Wars spin-off or something. It's kind of wild that it's actually been made.
The photographs of it, some of them are actually renders. The ones that look really Blade Runner, really like misty gold, they tend to be renders.
It does look good. I would like to go.
Yeah, they really felt an urgency, I think, about doing computers. And it's like they've been kind of practicing for a long time by pretending to be computers, by doing drawings which was sort of like... But the pretense that computers are much more convincing and computery than the real ones.
Yeah, it's interesting. I watched one of her lectures from the late 80s where she talks about everything is the kind of repeated phrases is all about surface and also kind of X-raying. They're not literally what computers are doing, but kind of effectively that's what computers are doing, especially in 3D CAD. It's all kind of like surfaces and visible transparency of apparently solid things.
computer drawing programs, certainly used by architects, don't render things as actual solids. They are points turned into lines, turned into surfaces.
What does the entry of the computer into the practice represent? Because I think that there are two explanations, or there are two potential dynamics. One is a kind of exogenous one, which is the computer is now, the computer is the moment, we've got to be a part of it. The other one is there are problems within the office, within the projects, which are incalculable without the kind of new power of the machine. And my feeling, I would sort of say now, and I kind of want to try and work out why this is the case, I sort of think that Patrick and the Patrick's sort of methods all come in because fundamentally they're actually needed for a whole series of different reasons. I think that's my kind of sense. I sort of think that one of the things the next episode we'll have to do is to try and decode that a little bit and try and pull out why that might be.
Yes, why? What do you think those problems are?
Well, I think that they are problems to do with designing the really big buildings. Some of them are just absolutely pragmatic problems, and some of them are also about finding an expanded kind of register of formal effects for these big and complex buildings. So when you see him kind of doing his presentation of the projects, the stuff that he talks about is all he's got all these new things like these kind of swarms or these kind of fields, or there's a kind of register of distortions which you can see why they're kind of germane or why they're align with Zaha's stuff. But I think that they also expand what the projects are about in a productive way. Well, not what the projects are about, but what the instruments they can bring to kind of resolve the projects are. I think he's important, and I think I'm sort of tiptoeing my way to being pro Patrick.
That's definitely what he's definitely trying to do is generate. It's. I feel that the start of a lot of Zaha's approaches are markmaking to start with. In the early days, the way of drawing, which could both be those swirly sketches, but also kind of painting approaches, which generate the first bit of the geometries, which is kind of instinctive and immediate. And then she has another approach, which is to take drawing techniques, projectional techniques, and then use them to distort things. So a lot of the buildings, the shapes of the buildings are a kind of 3D perspective distortion. The reason it's that funny shape is because that's a normal building which has had some sort of extreme perspective done on it. So using this sort of technical drawing projection things and using markmaking, Patrick really wants a world where you have this organic computer program into which you put a site and a seed, and it sort of blows through lots of different options and kind of grows itself. And there are lots of different kind of steps along the way, and perhaps at some point, the way in which it's growing is kind of really representing how it should be. But even if it's just a way of kind of making a shape, I think he's really interested in that as a stepping stone. And that's a somewhat different technique. I personally think you kind of can carry on with making paintings into buildings, and I think you can do a big building like that and a big building like Distortion.
No, I think it's not enough. It's not that you couldn't, or that you couldn't, if you were a different type of designer, you couldn't kind of keep worrying away at the same small but interesting problem. But I don't think it was possible. And I think also that I think that there was always a tension about the sort of scale, the kind of scale of project that they were doing. And you can see also why it helps a lot when you start having to try and work out the structures of all of these things. That there is like you do need to plug your weightless form finding engine into a kind of gravity filled steel designing engine and all of these.
Except those steel designing engines were pretty rubbish at the beginning. That's where they would be going eventually, but I'm not sure how useful they were in the early 90s.
I think that the language of fragmentation, and I think it's just played out at that point. I think if you look at the post-Cardiff competitions, like the Prado extension, for example, if you look at the contrast between the Prado extension in 95, is it 95? And then the Islamic Museum one in 97, it's running out of road, that approach. It's like, I don't know, how many more ways are there to turn a sort of fluid or jagged sketch into a building? You always end up resolving things at this like mega party kind of level, and then that's sort of it. And all the projects from those sort of years are a bit kind of casting around for what they're trying to do. The next one, which really, there's this habitable bridge one, which I guess is kind of interesting, but really it's when you get to the Museum of Islamic Art, which I think was a big competition and a big project and seems to have gone quite a long way, where suddenly you're getting this new thing designed around a sort of field, like manipulations of a sort of field. So you've had this infusion of idea, that whole kind of obsession with this landscape, parametric kind of landscape building, which has come out of digital architecture.
I mean, I think in its origin, that design comes as much from the painting and paper models, all of those models where they were cutting sheets of paper and folding it up and down. And in fact, I feel that in terms of the initial sort of proposals, like right up to Maxxi, it's kind of still quite...
They're coexisting, but I think that there's starting to be... That would be my... I don't have anything to base it on, but I feel like you're starting to see those things kind of bouncing off each other in a productive way.
It's difficult to know because so few of these buildings ever came to anything. I mean, what is the first big building? There are various small ones.
There's Cincinnati gets built. That's the art centre. I think that's completed a bit before the millennium. It starts getting going in the late 90s, early noughties, really. But I mean, Cincinnati is very much still of the kind of Cardiff Opera House model. Floating boxes, planes. To the extent that it has any fluidity, it's like a totally two-dimensional. The curvature of a piece of paper, it's not a kind of complex landscapey or field condition fluidity.
Is it kind of the compound curve? Is that something they're struggling with?
Well, that's something which is sort of difficult, or it's annoying to design without having computers, isn't it?
It's possible. People do it. Yeah, I think it's a pain. I think people make a value judgment as well at this juncture. Like, there's fans of both sides. And there's people who say, oh, it all went wrong when the computers came in. Or that's actually when, they became real buildings or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And I think they're probably both part of a kind of complicated working method, which is difficult for us to know.
Yeah, hard to see into. I think that there is a sort of difficult problem for us about how to get into the last 20 years or so of it is pretty hard to see inside.
They don't like talking about the early computers. They like talking about them once they start, working properly. But the sort of early struggles, I mean, it's clear looking... I mean, I would say that they would look back on them and recognise that they are not ideal. The outputs of them are not as good as they would be later.
That's the thing with early computer architecture. You do think what is the point of what they're actually doing here?
Yeah, because now it seems so crap.
It would be better to not use a computer if it's going to be like that.
Yeah. It's perfectly possible to design a building without a computer.
It was a real era of it. Competitions, if you look at visuals now, competitions from the... up until maybe 95, 96, the kind of computer visuals that you got for competitions are so rudimentary.
And they put so much time and money into them.
It was so hard to make them, but they were so rudimentary. And people would...
Compared to making the whole thing physically and then taking lovely photographs of it, which looks so much better.
People would get shortlisted for stuff which would be just a few really strange looking boxes or kind of
bluey, grey, green boxes
without any real indication of how, what's solid, what's a space, what's an absence, where the circulation is.
I mean, if you remember with Rem, his, like, Bibliothèque Nationale project, the computer drawings in that are like, it's a cube with a blob in it. And the blob is not a blobby, very blobby blob, and everything is green. Or, metallic blue.
Yes. That sort of works because it's a building which is not about human experience in any way at all. It's purely about this, like, extreme...
Well, it would have been, I mean, the thing would have been really strange if they built it. It would have been at some point.
Yeah, at some point it would have been inhabitable.
What is a loop-the-loop reading room?
They do turn out to be kind of fundamentally quite useful.
Computers. Yes, you can do a lot with them. Yes. They're great for working in 3D much more quickly.
I think at this point that you would still do building stuff in 3D at this point, like you were basically just keying in.
Oh yeah, definitely. I would have thought so. It's not that bad though, actually. Just keying everything in isn't that bad.
But it's a bit annoying to have to key in the Cartesian coordinates of where you're trying to put the thing.
Oh, I'm sure it would allow you to put in relative coordinates from the last point.
Oh, right. Yeah, but what if you wanted to pick something up again?
You can still select things.
I don't know. I remember talking to some people who were doing stuff on them at the time. They made it sound almost impossible.
I think they didn't work very well, but I don't think they were that bad. Like, you can still move points. It's just selecting is a bit of a faff. I think it perhaps would have a more horrendous learning curve, combined with very much the problem that you had with Final Fantasy VII, where it would just crash all the time, and every time you tried to do anything even remotely complicated, it would break, and then you'd have to go back. I mean, even in the 2000s, when we started rendering stuff, was just unbelievable. You'd leave it overnight, and then you find out that it was a bit crap, and then you'd
do another one.
Go, and then you leave it overnight, and it would have just crashed.
We're going to try and unpick all of that.
And try and get into... I think Patrick's a curious character. In some ways, he's like Zaha, in that he's a real enthusiast and seems kind of blinkered and hyper-focused. But in some ways, he's very unlike her. He's into erudition, scholarly argument, or at least that sort of way of talking. And he's into sort of politics. I'm not sure his contributions to politics are all that great.
I find him interesting, and he also has a big profile, like a really big profile, which I think it makes it difficult. I think it sort of overshadows slightly. We'll have to find a way to just sort of give an account of him and what he brings, but without...
We won't be able to do it justice, because I'm not reading the Autopoiesis of Architecture.
I think you can just watch the double lecture, the 6-hour double lecture.
They were kind of fashionable thing, these insanely long lectures. I'm not sure you can really take anything in a 6-hour lecture format.
No, I'm not sure it's a great format either.
I think probably a book is better. But the thing is, his book is not 6 hours long. I have a strong prejudice against the idea that any work of architectural theory can really be valid if it's that long. What are you doing with all those pages? I don't know how you can have an idea that's that complicated. It's not a legal case. It's not capital. You're not explaining the whole of society. Perhaps he is.
Yeah, I think that sort of comes in, yeah.
Explaining the whole of society in parts. If anyone has read and understands completely the Autopoiesis of Architecture, send us an email and tell us what it's ultimately all about. We will look at, I would think, the kind of lecture. Yeah, I'll look at the 6-hour lecture. I'll go through that. I might go through it at higher than 1 times speed, though. Glorious patrons, thank you very much.
So thanks a lot for subscribing to the podcast. Yes, makes a big difference.
Keeping the show on the road, it really is.
Thank you very much for that.
Good night.